Present day, my sexuality is being made more of than my music, but my music will last. This rubbish, will be gone.
In a world where musical brilliance often gets entangled with showmanship, George Michael stood as a lone sentinel, fiercely guarding the sanctity of authentic pop craftsmanship. Revered for his golden voice and timeless hits like Careless Whisper and Freedom, Michael was more than just a pop icon. He was a relentless perfectionist whose unyielding standards earned him admiration from fans and deep resentment from his peers. Behind the dazzling lights of global stardom, George Michael waged quiet but impactful wars with some of the most recognizable bands of his time, all in defense of a singular, unshakable belief that pop music should be emotionally honest, technically flawless, and uncorrupted by cheap theatrics. What many saw as collaborative camaraderie in the 1980s music scene, Michael saw as a battlefield of principles, whether behind closed doors or in subtle public snubs. His disapproval of artists who prioritized appearance, gimmickry, or superficial lyrics over genuine musicianship simmered into full-blown rivalries. And as we peel back the layers of polished pop from that era, a startling pattern emerges. 6 major bands found themselves caught in the crossfire of George Michael's impossible standards. Their stories reveal more than personal spats. They expose a silent war between style and substance, and a man who refused to let mediocrity wear the crown of music royalty. Today, we look behind the glamour to expose the artists who couldn't meet George Michael's golden standards and how his pursuit of perfection reshaped the landscape of modern pop forever. Coming in at number 6 is the explosive rivalry between George Michael and Culture Club, led by the equally flamboyant and outspoken Boy George. Though both artists rose from the gritty heart of London's club scene, their paths quickly diverged. In More Than Just Style, where Michael sought to elevate pop with meticulous composition and heartfelt lyricism, saw Boy George's brand of music as reliant on shock value and cosmetic flair. Privately, he dismissed Culture Club's success as the public's preference for costumes over content, allegedly saying Boy George was all outfit and no substance. The rivalry wasn't merely creative, it was deeply personal. Both men were cultural icons, androgynous trailblazers, and named George. But their parallel identities only intensified the competition. Witnesses recall Michael deliberately avoiding being photographed with Boy George at a 1984 awards show, reportedly telling his manager, "I won't be associated with someone who treats music like a costume party." A Wham! Constructed radio hits with precision and polish. Culture Club rose on waves of colorful theatricality and catchy hooks, a direction Michael viewed with disdain. He once told the Face magazine, without directly naming names, that some artists think outrageous outfits make them interesting musicians, clearly jabbing at his rival. From passive-aggressive interviews to active avoidance at high-profile events, the tension simmered beneath the surface for years. And though fans embraced both artists for their individuality, George Michael couldn't hide his disappointment that pop culture so often celebrated image over essence. For him, the rivalry with Culture Club was more than industry drama. It was a reflection of the ideological war raging within pop music itself. Asterisk. The clash between George Michael and Spandau Ballet wasn't just another tabloid rivalry, it was an embodiment of 2 conflicting visions for pop music during the neon-lit 1980s. Both emerged from the same fashion-conscious London club scene. But where Spandau Ballet flaunted tailored suits and runway charisma, Michael invested himself in song structure, lyrical depth, and emotional resonance. He reportedly referred to Spandau as fashion victims who stumbled into hits, irritated by what he saw as praise given to surface-level artistry. Their polished, stylish aesthetic clashed violently with Michael's definition of genuine music, and tensions reportedly peaked during the preparations for Live Aid, where George allegedly questioned the band's inclusion altogether, stating that the event was about serious music, not a fashion show. His critique didn't stop there. Private conversations with journalists, Michael was said to lament how bands like Spandau were celebrated more for their slick appearances than the strength of their songwriting, calling it runway music, crafted for those who cared more about looking cool than hearing something meaningful. He stopped just short of naming the band publicly, but often made pointed remarks in interviews, warning that some acts confuse the right haircut with having real talent. To Michael, Spandau Ballet represented everything wrong with the pop industry's drift toward shallow appeal. While both parties remained diplomatically silent in public, insiders knew that behind the scenes, Michael viewed Spandau's music as the kind of stylized spectacle that undermined the authenticity he fought so hard to protect. This wasn't jealousy, it was ideology. George Michael's contempt stemmed not from competition, but from a belief that Spandau Ballet stood for artifice in a time when the world desperately needed artists with depth. At number 4 on this countdown of George Michael's most intense rivalries sits a duo as critically praised as they were polarizing to the pop perfectionist himself, the Pet Shop Boys. Their intellectual, detached approach to pop music was a direct contradiction to Michael's emotionally raw and soul-bearing style, leading to a quietly burning feud that unfolded in interviews, award shows, and studio whispers throughout the late 80s. George Michael reportedly dismissed the duo as cold academics who turned mathematics into melodies, arguing their songs were designed for minds, not hearts, while the Pet Shop Boys earned widespread acclaim for their ironic lyricism and sophisticated production. Michael viewed their success as emblematic of an industry that had begun to reward pretension over passion. Some artists hide behind clever lyrics because they don't know how to make people feel anything, he allegedly confided to his inner circle.
Ow.
With sources later confirming these sentiments to Q magazine in 1987 and a 1988 industry showcase. George took his silent protest public, deliberately avoiding their performance and later telling his producer, "I don't need to watch people who think irony is a substitute for emotion." He believed pop should connect immediately and deeply, not require intellectual decoding. This rivalry wasn't just about two acts who happened to be popular at the same time. It was about a deeper philosophical division in pop's evolution. Should music move people emotionally or impress them with calculated cleverness? George believed the answer was obvious and was frustrated that critics often didn't agree. He saw the Pet Shop Boys not as rivals in popularity, but as representatives of a growing coldness in mainstream pop-mechanical detachment that he feared was replacing the soul of music. For George Michael, every beat, lyric, and vocal run carried an emotional payload. To him, the Pet Shop Boys brand of pop felt like it came from a boardroom. It's not a bleeding heart. Duran Duran's meteoric rise during the 1980s ushered in an era where music videos weren't just promotion, they were the product. And for George Michael, that shift was nothing short of betrayal. At number 3, this rivalry was grounded in a bitter resentment over what Michael perceived as style overtaking substance. Duran Duran representing the ultimate offense, a band whose glossy visuals, fashion-forward image, and MTV dominance seemed to overshadow their songwriting. Privately, George was blunt. According to several insiders, including former Smash Hits editor David Hepworth, he referred to Duran Duran as pretty boys who think expensive videos can replace talent, calling their hits fashion photography, set to synthpop. The bitterness ran so deep that at a 1985 industry party in London, Michael pointedly avoided their table, reportedly saying to bandmate Andrew Wrigley, "I won't be photographed with people who've turned music into a modeling assignment." It wasn't that Duran Duran lacked hits, Michael could see that. But what incensed him was how often critics equated their chart success with artistic merit. He believed their acclaim came not from emotional impact or musical complexity, but from haircuts, lighting, and location shoots in Sri Lanka. In interviews, Michael stopped just short of naming names but fired clear shots when he said, "Real pop stars should be known for their music first, not their cheekbones." The feud festered quietly for years, as both acts continued to top charts and compete for the same magazine covers and awards. But underneath the glitz was a philosophical chasm. George Michael believed that the music industry was beginning to reward branding over brilliance, and to him, Duran Duran symbolized that dangerous turn. Their rivalry was never about who had the better voice or the catchier hook, it was about what pop music was becoming. And George Michael wasn't ready to watch it be hijacked by fashion. Simple Minds, known for their booming stadium anthems and cinematic soundscapes, became unwitting adversaries of George Michael's mission to protect the sanctity of sophisticated pop, ranked at number 2. This clash between arena rock and intimate artistry highlights just how far George would go to defend his musical ideology. The Scottish band had risen to fame with hits like Don't You Forget About Me, crafting larger-than-life choruses that echoed across sold-out venues. But to George Michael, that very largeness was part of the problem. Privately, he accused Simple Minds of mistaking volume for emotion, reportedly telling confidants they were pretentious stadium rockers, whose success proved people confused bombast with depth. He drew a line between songs that filled arenas and those that filled hearts, saying that true emotional connection didn't require reverb-heavy vocals and echoing drums. It required honesty, nuance, and craft. This ideological tension boiled over in the late 1980s as both acts competed for soundtrack placements and big-budget production projects. At a 1987 music industry conference, Michael allegedly voiced frustration over Simple Minds being favored for a film score, stating, "Stadium rock shouldn't be confused with sophisticated pop just because it sells tickets." His critique wasn't rooted in personal animosity, but in his lifelong campaign against what he saw as empty musical grandstanding. While the public celebrated Simple Minds for their epic scale and soaring choruses, George saw their approach as formulaic, reliant on volume instead of vulnerability. To him, they represented a breed of musicians who prioritized anthem building over soul-bearing. And that, in his eyes, was musical heresy. Their songs may have blasted from arena speakers around the world, but to George Michael, they were hollow echoes compared to the precision and feeling he poured into every note. Asterisk, the most unexpected entry in George Michael's Hall of Silent Rivalries is also the most profound. Taking the number 1 spot is none other than Tears for Fears, a duo he saw not as enemies, but as dangerously close reflections of his own musical ethos gone awry. Both acts carved their names into pop history with psychologically rich lyrics, sophisticated arrangements, and mass appeal, yet to George, Tears for Fears represented a line that should never have been crossed. He allegedly labeled them therapy session musicians, accusing them of mistaking neurosis for depth and self-help slogans for lyrical substance. According to insiders like journalist Betty Page, Michael believed that while their songs sounded intelligent, they lacked the emotional authenticity that turned music into something truly moving. "Pop music isn't group therapy," he reportedly said to his producer after refusing to greet Tears for Fears at a 1988 showcase. What made this rivalry particularly intense was the overlap in their fan base, critics' praise, and even potential collaborative opportunities. George viewed their popularity as a dangerous endorsement of over-intellectualized pop. Once claiming they represented amateur psychology disguised as innovation, he felt that they turned their own internal crises into mass-market sing-alongs and feared that audiences were embracing emotional confusion instead of clarity. His frustration wasn't rooted in jealousy but in concern for what their success symbolized: a shift away from refined storytelling and toward emotional spectacle. While Tears for Fears delivered massive hits like Shout and Everybody Wants to Rule the World, George stood his ground, believing such music might resonate but did not enlighten. In the end, their feud wasn't about ego, it was about ideology. George Michael didn't just dislike their music, he feared its influence. And that fear placed Tears for Fears at the very top of the list of artists who could never meet his golden standards. Each of these 6 rivalries tells a story, not just about conflict, but about conviction. George Michael's unwavering belief in what music should be, and his refusal to compromise, even as the industry around him evolved. In an era dominated by MTV aesthetics, experimental synths, and postmodern irony, George stood as a last bastion of pop purity, saw the creeping commodification of the art form and called it out, even if it meant alienating friends, refusing collaborations, or turning his back on chart-topping acts. What others dismissed as petty industry spats were, for George, battles for the soul of music. His critiques weren't always gentle, or were they always fair, but they were rooted in a deep, almost spiritual commitment to craft. Where others chased trends, George demanded timelessness. Where some artists used spectacle, he He used silence and melody. These rivalries were less about hate and more about heartbreaker. Gifted artists watching an industry he loved change in ways he couldn't accept. And while he may have stood alone in many of these convictions, history has proven that his standards weren't just high, they were prophetic. Pop music would eventually become more about image than impact, algorithms than artistry. But long before that shift fully took hold, George Michael saw the signs, raised the alarm. It made it clear. For him, music wasn't just sound, it was truth. And anyone who didn't treat it with that level of reverence, well, they made his list asterisk years after his passing. The legacy of George Michael continues to ripple across the music world, not just through his timeless hits, but through the rigid artistic principles he fought to uphold. In an industry now dominated by algorithms, streaming charts, and viral moments, George's old battles take on new meaning. His disdain for theatrics, gimmickry, and synthetic emotion now reads less like snobbery and more like prophecy. Very bands he clashed with: Culture Club, Spandau Ballet, Duran Duran, Pet Shop Boys, Simple Minds, and Tears for Fears each represented trends and ideologies that have since become staples of pop music. Fashion-first branding, lyricism, high-production visuals, and emotionally performative songwriting. Yet despite the changing tides, George Michael's golden standard remains a haunting reminder of what pop music once aimed to be: honest, intimate, and beautifully composed. In interviews during the later years of his life, George often reflected on how misunderstood he felt, not because people didn't love his music, but because so few shared his obsessive devotion to doing it right. He reportedly once said, "My biggest mistake wasn't demanding perfection, it was expecting others to." Even as the industry celebrated him, George kept a critical distance, refusing to collaborate with artists he didn't believe in, turning down lucrative opportunities and isolating himself from scenes that rewarded flash over feeling. Today, younger generations discovering his discography are struck not just by the vocal mastery, but by the authenticity that pulses through every lyric, every harmony, every drop of reverb. He wasn't just crafting songs, he was crafting emotional landscapes that transcended trends. And in that commitment, he may have pushed away collaborators, but he created something far more enduring, a body of work that doesn't just age. Well, it gets better with time. While many of his peers faded or reinvented themselves to stay relevant, George Michael simply stayed excellent. And in a world now flooded with content, his perfectionism feels like a beacon for those who still believe music should be more than just content. It should be art. For every artist today who dares to aim higher, demand better, or say no to mediocrity, George Michael's spirit lives on. Not just as a voice from the past, but as a standard for the future. Asterisk as we close the chapter on these 6 rivalries and the philosophies that fueled them. 1. Question lingers like the final note of a haunting ballad. Was George Michael simply too demanding, or was he the exact type of uncompromising force the pop industry desperately needed? In hindsight, his criticisms, often delivered in hushed backstage comments, pointed interviews, or symbolic snubs, weren't the tantrums of a bitter artist, but the convictions of a man who refused to watch his craft be cheapened. Where others saw a world of opportunity to collaborate, experiment, and monetize, George saw a battlefield of integrity versus indulgence. His disdain wasn't for popularity, it was for the erosion of meaning. And while the artists he reportedly clashed with went on to have their own careers, legacies, and reinventions, it's George Michael's music that continues to be studied, revered, and rediscovered. He made songs that weren't just hits, they were hymns for the misunderstood, anthems for the heartbroken, and elegies for the honest. And perhaps that's why his standards hurt so many feelings along the way, because he forced people to look at what they were really making. The tension with Culture Club wasn't just about costumes, it was about emotional sincerity. His feud with the Pet Shop Boys wasn't about electronics, it was about emotional detachment. His criticism of Tears for Fears wasn't about mental health, it was about exploiting it for sonic drama. All of it points back to one thing. George Michael was never just making pop music. He was making art with surgical precision and soulful truth, and he couldn't bear to see the form diluted. So was he too demanding? For some, yes. For the industry, maybe. But for the fans, the millions who found healing, reflection, and resonance in his music, he was the exact kind of artist the world needed. In a business addicted to compromise, George Michael never settled. And for that, we don't just remember him, we thank him. Because in the end, it wasn't about who he clashed with. It was about what he stood for. And long after trends have faded, his golden standard still shines.